because China's no threat to the United States, but this upsets the U.S. idea of hegemony. So the U.S. is taking action. China's not aiming to invade any place. It is aiming to avoid U.S.-imposed choke points.
Let me ask you something. Why does China worry so much about United States? If you follow the news, you probably hear the same explanation again and again. China is becoming stronger, China is becoming more powerful, and China could eventually challenge America's position in the world. But what if there is another side to this story? What if the rivalry between China and the West is not just about politics, ideology, or who has the better system? What if, underneath all the headlines, there is a much bigger struggle happening? A struggle over something much more basic: energy. Because China may be the world's largest manufacturing powerhouse, but there is one thing that keeps this entire machine running: oil. And the problem is, China does not control the routes that bring most of that energy to its shore. According to economist Jeffrey Sachs, understanding this energy problem is one of the keys to understanding why tensions between China and the West continue to grow. Take a look.
And right now it aims at China for no reason whatsoever, because China's no threat to the United States. China doesn't have the least interest in destabilizing the U.S. China doesn't have the least capacity to threaten the United States, to endanger the United States. But yes, China would like to develop, and it's doing so splendidly. It's doing so brilliantly. It's doing so to the benefit of the whole world, by the way, because the technologies that it's bringing are of benefit to the whole world. But this upsets the U.S. idea of hegemony. So the U.S. is taking action. It has invaded Venezuela and Iran for a related purpose: stop the oil flowing to China, control yet another choke point in the world economy. It is delusional, but I'm trying to explain these are the real delusions that we have and that have been long-standing. The U.S. is in a neurotic state, not just our neurotic president. But the neurosis is that China is big and successful and growing. I can tell you from my own experience of 45 years of visiting China, typically many times a year. China is enormously successful, very well governed, looking ahead, making great strides, and benefiting the whole world in what it's doing. It is not a threat to anybody, actually. Even in the South China Sea and the contested borders, it is trying to avoid U.S. Navy choke points. This is what we call the security dilemma. China is not aiming to invade any place. It is aiming to avoid U.S.-imposed choke points, which, by the way, are freely discussed in our journals and magazines and lectures. The choke points, the first island chain, for example. What a horrible idea, the first island chain. That's an idea of one of our worst foreign ministers, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who said, "We will limit China's access to the blue ocean by the first island chain." Everything is against someone else. So a lot of what's happening in the world, whether it's invading Venezuela or attacking Iran, is also about the U.S. policies to try to corral the world energy sector so that it has more leverage against China. It's to stop the flow or to regulate the flow, to put it under U.S. control. By my count, the United States indirectly controls about 2/3 of the world's oil flows, if you count countries that have U.S. military bases or are under U.S. control. And it's aiming for three more. One, to bring Russia to account through its international sanctions regime. Second, to bring Venezuela into account through kidnapping the president and threatening the government with further murders or kidnappings. And third, to bring Iran into the fold by reversing Iran's revolution in 1979, which was a revolution to reverse a police state that had been imposed by the United States in 1953, when the United States and Britain, the CIA and MI6, overthrew a democratically elected government of Prime Minister Mossadegh and installed a police state. So if you add those three countries, the United States would control almost 90% of the world's oil exports. That's the aim. That's part of this tactic of hegemony. It's not incidental. It's not coincidental that all of this is happening. Even the U.S. bombing in Nigeria. The U.S. bombed Nigeria in November. That's to remind another oil state, be careful, we can bomb you too. That wasn't about Boko Haram or anything else. That was looking down the list of all of the oil states that are not quite in U.S. control. An Italian journalist put it very well. He recently posted, Americans are very lucky. Every time they bring freedom to another country, they find oil.
Alright, now let's break down what Professor Jeffrey Sachs means, because this is where things get very interesting. Think about China for a moment. Over the past few decades, China has transformed itself into the factory of the world. We all know this, right? Your smartphone, your electronics, electric vehicles, solar panels, machineries, and countless products around the world are connected to the Chinese manufacturing. But behind this incredible economic success is one major challenge. China needs a huge amount of energy. And unlike some countries that have large domestic energy supplies, China depends heavily on imported oil and gas from other parts of the world. Every single day, millions of barrels of oil travel thousands of kilometers from places like Middle East and Africa before reaching China. And most of that energy has to travel by sea. That creates a problem. Imagine building the biggest factory in the world, but that fuel keeps your factory running has to pass through a narrow road that someone else could potentially block. That is exactly the concern behind what China calls the Malacca Dilemma. The Strait of Malacca, located between Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, is one of the most important shipping routes on Earth. A large amount of China's energy imports pass through this narrow waterway before reaching Chinese ports. So from China's perspective, there is one simple question. What happens if relations with other major powers get worse and this important route becomes restricted? For Beijing, this is not just an economic issue. It is a national security concern. And this helps explain many of China's actions over the past few decades. For example, China's Belt and Road Initiative is not only about building infrastructure overseas. From China's perspective, it is also about creating more options. Instead of relying on one major route, China wants alternative ways to bring in energy and trade goods. That includes pipelines connecting China with Central Asia and Russia, railway networks across Eurasia, and ports that can support global trade. Now, the goal is simple. Make sure China is never completely dependent on one single path. And this is where the bigger US-China competition begins. Because when one country tries to reduce its weaknesses, another country may see that as a challenge. The United States sees China's growing influence as a threat to the existing global order. But from China's perspective, the situation looks very different. Chinese leaders often believe that American alliances, military presence in Asia, and control over important sea routes create pressure around China's borders. This is why places like the South China Sea and Taiwan have become so important. To many people outside China, these actions may look aggressive, but from Beijing's point of view, they are connected to a bigger goal: avoid being surrounded and cut off. And this is what makes the US-China rivalry so complicated. The interesting thing is that both sides believe they are acting defensively. The United States believes it is protecting security and maintaining stability. China believes it is protecting itself from being contained. This creates what experts call a security dilemma. Basically, when one country takes actions to make itself safer, the other side may see that action as a threat. And then both countries respond by taking even more actions, creating a cycle that becomes harder and harder to break. So when we look at the competition between China and the West, it is important to look beyond the headlines. This is not just about politics. It is about geography. It is also about resources. It is also about technology. And it is also about who controls the networks that keep the modern world running. Whether you agree with China's approach or not, one thing is clear. A country that depends on foreign energy and vulnerable trade routes will naturally try to reduce those risks. And that is why China has spent decades building new connections, developing alternative trade routes, and investing heavily in energy security. Because in the 21st century, countries do not only compete with armies, they compete through technology, infrastructure, resources, and the ability to survive in an uncertain world. So what do you think? Is China's rise a threat to the world? Or is China simply responding to the pressure it feels from a changing global order? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep dives into geopolitics and the forces shaping our world. Thank you for watching.